Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fireside chat on developing, scaling, and adapting your mobile product strategy. Before we get into introductions, just a few quick logistical notes. This is mostly structured as a fireside chat for the first 15 minutes or so, but feel free to keep dropping in questions into the chat. I believe it's called Stage, and I'll try to make sure I work them into all the questions I ask Raj. And towards the end, we'll spend most of our time purely answering audience questions. And so a quick intro about myself. I'm Pranav. I'm a group product manager here at Mixpanel, focused on growth, pricing, and data quality. And for those of you who don't know Mixpanel, we're a product analytics company, mostly helping teams build better products. And today I'm thrilled to be hosting this fireside chat with Raj Krishnan, who is the VP of product at Noom and one of the fastest growing companies I bet we all know. And so Raj has been at Noom for about 5.5 years and has been the head of product for most of that time, managing a large team of 15 PMs and UX designers. And during his time at Noom, he's seen it grow from single-digit millions in revenue all the way to $230 million last year. And prior to Noom, he was at Google, again, building search products for a lot of features that impacted billions of users every day. And Raj has an educational background studying AI and operations research at MIT. And one of the things I'm most excited about, Raj, is that you love board games, and as do I. So once this pandemic is over, I bet we'll have a good board games night going. So with that, I'd love to hand off to Raj. Raj, just tell us a little bit more about Noom, about your history there, and we can get started.
Great. Thanks, Pranav, for the intro. I appreciate it. By the way, we don't have to wait until the pandemic is over to play board games. There's a lot of virtual games out there, so I'll send you a link afterwards. But yeah, thank you so much for the intro, and I'm super excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk about Noom. I'm excited to talk about the mobile strategies that we've deployed over time, and happy to give a little bit of a background on our journey, my journey to Noom, and what we've done since then. And then take it from there. So a lot of people don't realize, because most people only heard about us in the last couple of years since we've been blitzing various ad channels. But Noom has actually been around for a long, long time. Just to put it in context, when the iOS App Store launched in 2008, Noom as a company had already been there for a year. We weren't called Noom then; we were called WorkSmart Labs. But the early days, our founders Artem and Seju essentially tried to create a company with a very particular mission that's basically unchanged till today, which is taking technology and applying it to help people live healthier lives. And there's been a lot of, obviously, as is always the case, zigs and zags along the road. But in particular, I think the ascendancy of mobile as a technology and as a platform in the late 2000s and early 2010s made us realize that there was an opportunity to leverage that technology in a way that was really powerful, because everyone is walking around with this amazing device in their pockets. And that was particularly relevant for the kinds of change that we wanted to bring to the world. Behavior change is one that is an always on kind of thing. And so it's very much dependent on this idea of having technology present in your pocket, which is where we went in the following years. So we had a few years of like pure automated tech-based app solutions in the early 2010s. Did things like App Store ranking optimizations, but in general, we did pretty well in terms of those things, but it was fundamentally a pretty commodified product area. And so really started to try to figure out ways to both boost the product efficacy as well as really tinker with the business model in a way that would be a little bit more powerful. That was roughly when I joined the company. So 2015, it was a bit of a transition period. So a lot of my core product experience at that time was from Google, which for a long time was web-based. We were just starting to get into more of the mobile edict of things that Larry and Sergey were pushing at Google at the time, but hadn't really done that much with native mobile work until I came to Noom. And the biggest thing that I was looking for at that time was mission-driven focus. That was what fundamentally drew me. We did a little bit of dabbling for a few years in my early years at Noom on a few different alternate business models. By dabbling, I mean like a couple of years of flying all over the country, working with insurers and healthcare providers and all these partnerships. But in around 2016, 2017, we settled on a B2C product fundamentally, And I think a lot of the success that we've seen and the growth that we've seen since then was due to a few different factors. So one is a very core difference from what we had done before, which is the introduction of coaching. So the idea of coupling this really powerful technology with a human element as well, because we found that for the kinds of things we needed to drive, you really need to have some sense of accountability and relationships that's going to keep you motivated over the difficult periods. But we also wanted to do that at scale. And so doing that combination was one that we found really differentiated us from a lot of other products at the time. The other was the idea of a course concept, the idea that you come out of the Noom program with a certain bundle of skills that you didn't have going in. And that's fundamentally what we're selling. And then the third thing, which is, I think from a process standpoint, maybe particularly relevant for today, was a really experimentally driven approach. So first, we applied that to our growth marketing team and used that to drive a lot of the acquisition side, since that was our primary bottleneck. And then since then, we brought it to the core product side as well. So we've run, I don't know, something like 1,000 growth experiments in the last few years, I think, as well as over 200 core product experiments in the last few years. And so I think it's been a really interesting experience for us with this level of change. To give you a sense of where we are in the curve, about a year and a half ago, the product team consisted of myself and 2 other PMs. I was still like an IC role on one of the teams. And then now we've basically quadrupled the team. I'm up to 9 PMs and a few designers and user researchers. And I think we'll probably continue to quadruple over the next year and a half. So really exciting to see and think about like what product development looks like at these different stages.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's fantastic to see this growth both in your team as well as Noom's revenue and the number of product lines you're starting to explore. I'd love to understand a little bit more about that last piece and experimentation. So tell me a little bit more about the experimentation philosophy at Noom, and also how does it play out when you start executing on experiments, and what are some things you've learned along the way?
Yeah, sure. Good question. As I mentioned, I love talking about experiments because they're very much like a thing that I get excited about thinking about. So we went through a number of different phases. I think like the idea of A/B testing is not a new thing when it comes to product and technology, although it's something that I think has really grown into its own in the last few years. We early on, especially when we were in more of the pure technology, AI, not human coaching stages in the first half of the decade, we did experiments, but we tended not to actually pay very close attention to the results. We actually had sort of the technology side of it, but not the process discipline side of it. So we would run an experiment. We would see, okay, this metric is up and this metric is down. And well, as long as I can find some metric that has moved, that sounds like a win. Let's launch it, which ends up almost being the worst of both worlds because you're investing all this time in running these experiments, but then actually not utilizing the framework as well as you could. So then we got to a point where, because we were doing a lot of, actually, I mentioned a few years of enterprise work, oftentimes enterprise work does not lend itself very easily to experimentation because you're working with a partner who might have some concerns about this kind of divergence in the experience in their users, or because you just don't have the volume. That can sometimes be the case as well. And so we kind of lost a little bit of that culture for a few years. So it wasn't until the last few years that we really started to get a lot more robust with our approach to this, in terms of bringing back that experimental mindset, but then also thinking about how you actually do the full circle. So we talk about, it's not a very common concept, we talk about the build, measure, learn cycle. That's a very foundational concept in the way we think about it, where we know that the first time we tackle a problem is not going to be successful. There's a few principles that I'd call out that I think have been relevant. You talked about things that we've learned. I'd say there's a few things that I would call out. One is as we think about the growth trajectory and being at different levels of scale as a company, there's a nice parallel progression as you grow, at least in the consumer space. So one is you're getting more revenue generally as you grow, which means that a smaller percentage of increase in any of your KPIs like retention can net the same size revenue gains. So essentially you can pursue smaller and smaller wins, but they're still just as valuable. And then at the same time, you're probably getting more volume to play with as well. So you can actually get statistical significance for smaller and smaller percentages and detect them as wins. And then at the same time, you also have generally a larger product and engineering team, so you can pursue those smaller wins and like do a lot more optimization. So there's a nice parallel growth progression on all of these fronts that tend to reinforce each other. But then the other flip side that I would say that we've really started to appreciate in the last year or so is that A/B testing is a great gold standard, but there's actually a huge variety of tools in our toolkit, right? You can actually measure, even if you can't do a proper A/B test, you can measure a particular metric week after week, and then track a particular value, launch something, and see if the movement was significant or not. So there's a lot of statistical techniques that you can leverage that really requires a strong data science team to be partnered closely with product and design to help drive some of those insights.
There's a huge thread on Twitter maybe a week ago, which was all about like when do you decide when to A/B test something versus when to just launch it, and lots of different contradictory opinions. Love to get your take on that.
Yeah, I don't think I read that thread, but certainly it's a thing that we're very is very familiar. I'd say there's a couple of things that I'd say it actually ladders up, I think, into a broader question, which is what's the right balance to strike between optimization versus more like product strategy, product vision, and what's the right way to balance between the two? And there's absolutely a balance that has to be struck, I think, because sometimes you can micro optimize, like fundamentally you're micro optimizing, which means you can achieve a local optimal value of something, but you have no idea what else is out there unless you make a larger jump, what I like to call sometimes valley jumping, which is like, okay, from a strategy standpoint, you end up in a completely different place. In terms of the question of like when you pull the trigger on something versus you don't, I think there's a couple of, I think the biggest factor is uncertainty, right? What's the likelihood of uncertainty that you might have in the particular idea that you're testing, like the hypothesis that you're testing, and whether you would actually be swayed, what you would actually be swayed by in terms of the results, right? So it's really important to almost imagine yourself several weeks down the road having the results of your experiment and looking at them and saying like, what decisions would I make differently based on this result or not? A good example is like we had some, fundamental UI UX issues that we wanted to clean up earlier this year. One of the example was that we had a long-standing design pattern that was somewhat inconsistent with traditional iOS design patterns in terms of like how you do navigation between different screens and the navigational hierarchy. And this was one where we actually have been surprised in the past by doing things that seemed like normal design patterns, but didn't quite fit our particular user experience, or for a variety of reasons. Like every user is on their own unique journey with their product. And so sometimes it applies and sometimes it doesn't. So in that case, we did run an experiment because we had some evidence that there's sometimes downsides. But in other cases, if you're like, well, I really don't expect the odds of actually having any sort of movement in this metric is so low that the most likely outcome is a neutral result, like 95, 98% likely that it's going to have a neutral result. And if it is a neutral result, I'm going to launch it anyways. And it's aligned with my product vision. And it's maybe like not a lot of engineering effort to actually baseline the feature. Like maybe it's a single screen UI change, doesn't require a lot of backend data work or anything like that. That would be those are all strong signals to suggest that you just pull the trigger in baseline rather than going through the process of experimentation. A big learning for us was that experimenting seems like a kind of like get out of jail pass to like avoid product thinking. And in fact, it's not, because experimentation can lead you down strange paths. And also it can be kind of expensive to get a good, robust experiment out. It's like, several weeks of time on the calendar to like let your metrics mature, as well as, of course, the engineering and design time. So we rediscovered recently the importance of actually incorporating product thinking into the experiment process and having user research part of the process so that you're having even faster iteration cycles. So I do think that like you absolutely need to keep in mind that balance.
Great. Morgan asked a question that's sort of top of mind for me as well. With smaller teams, at least at Mixpanel, we have experiments that are running in different parts of the product. So for the most part, any user experience is localized to that particular part of the product. But as you grow and you have a more combined shared surface area, and like today you're at 9 PMs, if you're at 36 PMs, say next year, how do you think about keeping that user experience consistent across the product as all of these different teams are running their own A/B tests and experiments?
Do you mean are you talking about like the validity of experiments and making sure that experiments don't interfere with each other? Or do you mean having a solid user experience that doesn't cause conflict between different parts of the user experience?
More the latter than the first one.
Got it. I think a lot of that, especially as you start to grow the org, I think a lot of that comes down to organizational aspects and like what the interfaces are and like commitments are from individual teams. It's almost less about, I think it's less about almost product than it is about organizational insights and organizational development. So one of the things I've been struggling with this, honestly, as we think about the growth of the product team in the next year and how to potentially organize our product team. So to make it more concrete, for instance, Noom as a product has several different surfaces, what I call surfaces, which is what you would traditionally think about the way to chunk up a product. So we have a coaching feature and you interact with the coach, and we have a food logging feature and you do food logging, and we have a content feature and you read content. And all of these get exposed to the user kind of simultaneously of different tasks of different type. So right now my team is organized by surface, like different PMs work on different surfaces, and it has the nice quality that you become an expert in that surface. And there are like metrics that you can orient around those surfaces. However, the side effect of that is that all of these concepts, coaching, food logging, content, get exposed to the user essentially in the first couple of days. And so that first couple of day experience, all the PMs are pulling in different directions. So I think that's like a good example of this kind of potential challenge. So another way of organizing it is based on user state, where it's like, okay, think about, you actually want a PM or a team of PMs that are responsible for the first 3 days of the user experience. And literally they have, and the key thing there is like, do you give them success metrics and goal them around something that's relevant to that group? Like what's the, like almost like a funnel metric. What percentage of the people that sign up actually make it past those first few days and are still engaged and haven't canceled, et cetera. But then you have the flip side that you don't have that expertise developing in specific surfaces, and you also have the possibility that an individual feature in the minds of the user ends up getting seam points. Like what you don't want is you don't want the lines of your product organization appearing in your product, right? That's the thing you have to be careful about. My view on this generally that I'm thinking about is that a lot of it depends on the size of your organization. If you and the idea is that you can have that kind of overlap. You can have some PMs responsible for individual surfaces and other PMs responsible for user stages, as long as they are really well aligned and know each other really well. So for instance, you could construct a pod of 5 or 6 PMs, 7 PMs, which is probably the limit of like a really good working relationship, where some of them have surface responsibilities and some of them have stage level responsibilities, and then just expect them to work it out. Like collectively, they'll have a particular metric like retention over a period of time, and then it's up to them to really work through those kinds of conflicts and know what each other is doing. And I think that can work, and it can even be kind of healthy disagreement where you have a lot of different ideas coming through. If you try to replicate that same model over 30 PMs, I have a feeling that it will fail, because so much of that working relationship depends on, honestly, the compatibility between the PMs and the familiarity and the knowledge. And so then when you get to that larger scale, you really have to orient around, we're going to chunk off, let's say, one population of users. So for us, that's likely to be around the different types of product offerings that we have. So I might have one chunk of PMs working on weight loss, but a different chunk of PMs working on mental health and stress. And so that they are fairly isolated and can work somewhat independently. But within those areas, you can have a lot of thrashing.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I think even at Mixpanel, we've been through all of these different iterations where we went from service ownership to individual reports to now persona-based. Like it doesn't seem like there's any one model which works perfectly across all scenarios. So I guess
I've heard legends. I don't know if this is true, of organizations that actually purposely reorganize every year so that you just, because there's no perfect solution, you just force everyone to like go through the process of changing. So you remember what you used to do, and now you're doing something different.
That does sound like a good idea. So switching topics a little bit, one of the things I found really interesting about GNOME and our last conversation was there's a fairly large sign-up form which has what we would typically think of as friction. And I think I'm seeing this in a few other apps as well. If you think about Superhuman, again, they have a really long sign-up form. You have to talk to someone to get onboarded. So there's a combination of like high friction as well as a human touch to many of these apps, where earlier people were focused much more on automation. So can you tell me a little bit more about that thinking, about what went into that? Also, how do you trade off what should be done through technology? Where do you reduce friction versus add friction?
Got it. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I definitely get that question, a lot from folks that I'm talking to. So I mentioned earlier those 2,000-ish, 1,000 plus experiments that we've done on the growth side. Many of them were focused on questions of optimizing that onboarding process and getting people not just in the door and like signing up for a trial, but actually excited about the program, and then converting, longer term. So a lot of those experiments were oriented around literally like converting to subscriptions past the trial and becoming engaged users. The thing that, it actually defies, it was really shocking and surprising to us, like how high the tolerance was for users to give us information about themselves and just be like very positive and excited about it. Like it turns out that there's a limit. We're sort of like approaching the limit now, I think, in terms of where we are. We could probably get a little bit more, do a few more questions than we are now, but I think at some point there's diminishing returns. But for a long time, way higher than we thought, we were able to essentially ask users to provide information about themselves and make it clear that that information was going to be used in constructing a personalized experience for them in the form of, let's say, the coach getting that data and being able to work with them on it. And users found it really powerful because the idea ultimately, like people don't actually mind talking about themselves. To a certain extent, it's actually even enjoyable. Depending, of course, on the style of question, like open-ended questions, I think are a little bit more scary. But answering like simple multiple choice questions about themselves is a really powerful way to actually get them bought into the program, learning about some of the qualities that we thought was important. And it actually tended to generally improve conversion. Adding more questions was almost always neutral or positive. And I think that was really a lesson for us in terms of like how important it was for folks that they took this journey so seriously that they wanted to make sure that we had all the information that we needed to make that, to make a program that was effective for them. And honestly, it's not like you kind of see this as well in the popularity of online quizzes and personality tests and stuff like that. So I think there's an element there of like people really liking to extract out information about themselves.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the experimentation and finding this almost counterintuitive thinking of like adding more questions isn't always bad. It's kind of been drilled into us now. Make the sign-up form simpler. Just like have it down to one field.
Yeah, I think it needs to be fun and interesting and feel like you're going to get value out of it. I think valueless work is absolutely going to be detrimental, but the idea that you're actually going to get value out of it is, I think, a very powerful motivator.
Can we talk a little bit more about the human side of this? So I understand GNOME has almost 1,000 coaches.
Actually, over 2,000.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, over 2,000.
So there's an audience question about this as well. So one is just how does this work in scaling this in an affordable manner for GNOME? But also, second, how do you balance where the human needs to play a role versus where you'd rather have this done by technology or by some algorithm?
Yeah, I love this question. So I think the answer to honestly both of those questions starts out in a similar place, which is that it's not a binary choice. It's like, oh, this is handled by the AI and this is handled by the coach. We're really trying to build a technology-assisted human being or a technology-human hybrid, which means that we need a spectrum, right? So you could imagine at the lowest scale, things that truly are automated. In fact, we have some of these today, right? Like there's certain things that if you say a certain message to the coach, we'll actually respond with an automated message and make clear that it is automated. And it's something that's like very operational, right? Like subscription related things. And then of course, they're like extremely complex, really like what you think of as true coaching questions that could come up. Like, I'm stepping on the scale every day. I've been doing everything that I need to do, and I'm still not seeing my weight come down. What do I do? I feel like really crushed. What should I do? And it has to be a human being that's like really weighing in on those kinds of questions. So you need probably a human element to it, because there's such a high element of empathy, and the knowledge that it might be automated is probably a little bit undercuts the value of that interaction. But in between those two, there's a wide range, right? There's our system offering suggestions of messages that could be sent to the coach. We have an internally built dashboard that coaches use that gives them all the data and information they need, as well as sometimes offers suggestions of messages that they can then edit or just send as is. There's data, like what's the most relevant data. A lot of the work of the coach sometimes is trying to figure out what they can reference. So for instance, in the situation I just described, maybe the right thing is to actually reference some of the successes that the user has had earlier in the program and reorient them on the length of their journey, and the fact that, this scale, the weight graph looks like this now, but before that, there was a big drop. And that's what you need to really focus on, that you're maintaining that weight loss. So that can take a while for the coach if they have to dig through the data themselves, but surfacing that data can be really powerful. You could also imagine a wide range of different individuals involved in the interaction, almost like a coaching team, where you have more senior coaches that are really involved in a lot of the motivational elements, more junior coaches who are maybe involved in some of the more pragmatic, but still program relevant things like nutritional questions. What's with this red, yellow, green color system that you use? Or like, how should I think about, like, is 10,000 steps really the right number? Spoiler alert, turns out it's not. That's just a nice round number. The actual number is a little bit lower. So like stuff like that, which are a little bit more knowledge-based, but don't require as intensive training, down to even more subscription-related questions. Like you'd imagine support team members being part of the process, helping people connect their Fitbit, right? So there's a wide range. So there's this wide range of things that you can do, and you can imagine different levels. So a lot of it is honestly understanding how almost repetitive is the action that a coach would take. So you start with the really high touch stuff. You start with a very high touch approach in general. So almost everything I described might be done by a coach initially, which it was in the early days of Noom. And then gradually you see what tends to be most easily automated or most easily assisted. And when you see those patterns, that's what you start to carve out and scale up. So in the process of scaling up from where we were, 4 years ago, we were at a very low ratio of user to coach. But in the process of scaling up that ratio, and this gets back to the scaling question that someone asked, like, how do you make it operate at scale? You start to take pieces of that and say, okay, this piece doesn't require the level of training that we've done for the coaches. We can put it into one of these other buckets, automated or automated assisted or whatever. And that allows you to start scaling up the efficacy. And by the way, eventually, the other element to it is that not everyone needs a coach all the time. So you're on a journey. In fact, many users come in with a very high level of motivation, and there may not be that much for the coach to do at the beginning, other than just like establish rapport with the user. It's really when that motivation starts to ebb, when you kind of fall off the wagon and have like a bad day from your perspective in terms of your health and behavior. That's when you need a coach. That might be several weeks into your journey. And so another part of it is really understanding when is the right opportune moment to intervene, which is fundamentally a data question.
Absolutely. So you've mentioned both data in the context of A/B testing, as well as data for what your coaches use, and a lot of your experimentation framework. So I'd love to understand your broader tech stack. How has it evolved from, like the single-digit million days where maybe it was a much simpler tech stack today, where you probably have just like zillions of tools interacting with each other?
Yeah, the analytic tech stack in particular you're talking about, right?
Some about analytics, but also like experimentation, what the coaches use, what have you had to build in-house?
That's great. Give me a chance to plug something that I've been meaning to plug also. Um, when we started, I mean, we built our some of the elements of our system are actually homegrown, and some of them are utilizing some of the existing technologies that are out there. So, for instance, we've used Optimizely for a long time for like forking some of our web tools. We do make big use of Mixpanel in terms of understanding like the deep analytics in terms of user behavior, since our product is so complex in terms of user behavior, and minute differences could make a difference in terms of users' long-term engagement. So, some of those things have been around with us for a long time. I think in particular, the transition that happened as we scaled up was just basically the robustness of the tools that we started leveraging, and how seriously we took. I think if there's a unifying principle, I would say it was a realization of how important making data easy to get to versus trivial to get to, how much of a difference there is between those two, right? Like easy to get to means, oh yeah, I mean, this wasn't that easy, but like easy to get to means I have a page that I can go to where I type in some of the attributes that I want, and I can hit a button and I get a report that gives me the results. And for a long time, we were like, yeah, that's great. We had an internal tool that we called Reports Magic, which basically allowed you to generate reports on a bunch of different metrics for different populations. And it was like very configurable. And for us, it seemed like that was like the premiere in terms of capabilities, right? We felt like we were on the cutting edge. And then about 2 years ago, we switched over to actually build out a data warehouse and started using Looker. And then it was like really kind of a revelation for us, because when you make it trivial, when it's literally a URL that you can go to and it's a dashboard that updates in real time, and that's true for some of our backend data on Looker. It's also true for some of our more user-facing data via Mixpanel dashboards. It's like a whole different ballgame. Like we'll sit there and we'll be tracking, particularly around critical periods, like New Year's for us is a really big time. So we'll be sending around Mixpanel links to show what the acquisition funnel looks like. That a lot of the key stakeholders are watching all the time, and just literally hitting refresh like every couple of minutes, or getting notification, like automated notifications. And we'll sometimes have to make real-time decisions in terms of ad spend, or in terms of like tweaking things in the buy flow on the fly based on some of those updates. And it's like there's those kinds of clear decision-making impacts, but then there's also just it's a little bit more abstract, but it's almost like goaling the team around a specific metric is so much easier when you have that metric present all the time. And I think a lot of the tools that we've built since then on the analytics side have been oriented towards that. On the generalized experiment stack, I mentioned that we did some homegrown tooling that we built on top of Optimizely to do the randomization. We have some technologies that we built to be able to make a lot of the features that we can turn on and turn off for different user experiences more accessible. So the idea that was really an exercise in shifting the burden of responsibility from engineering to like less and less technical folks, so that content writers or PMs and et cetera could actually be running those experiments. So we're pretty happy with the trajectory there. The place we're at now is actually, we've reached the point where while our user volume and revenue does keep growing, it's actually not quite keeping pace with the rate of experiments that we want to run. So we're actually starting to hit some bottlenecks in terms of testing volume. So we're starting to play around with what we're calling multiple or overlapping experiments, which means a single user might be getting different experiences at once, which is a very tricky thing because sometimes those things have interaction effects. So that's kind of the new frontier for us in terms of technology tooling. But I just want to say, and this is where I would make the plug to some of the other companies that are out there, the upper bound on experiment tooling systems is very, very high. It's just like mind-boggling how much complexity and how large a team you can have. I encourage folks who are interested in this space to like look at Booking.com, take a look at some of the stuff that's out there from Google. They literally have research scientists working and breaking new ground in terms of how experiment analysis can be done, and experiment platforms can be built. Giant teams working just on nothing else but enabling other companies, like other teams and PMs, to run experiments effectively. It's actually kind of humbling that, we constantly think we've made a lot of progress, and then we see how much further there is to go.
Yeah, no, there's just so much there. Like, I think Airbnb and Netflix also have some of their own internal dashboards and what that looks like, which is just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Switching again a little bit to war stories and huge wins. So what I'd love to hear about is, like, for all of us on the outside, Gnome looks phenomenal. We've seen this great growth trajectory. I'd like you to think back to some phenomenal wins, but also like some terrible war stories where it was like, oh my God, like this was so wrong. And just tell us about those and what you learned.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a couple of good ones. In general, I would say our benchmark is about 10% of our experiments that we launch actually result in baselines. 90% result in like, oh, nope, back to the drawing board in some way, which is why it's really important to have good analytics discipline and extract out useful information. Let's see. So here's a couple of interesting learnings. So one is one that we did around the pacing of our program. So really fundamental change to the way the program works. So for a long time, and we knew that this was a core issue, which is that users felt like the program was too demanding. We were asking too much of them. There was too much to do each day. And then also if you missed a day or if you fell behind, it was like you were at a lecture series with a professor who didn't know your name. They just like kept on going and you had to get the class notes from somebody else in order to catch up. And so we knew we wanted to change this. There was constant feedback about it being like a low empathy experience, and we were all about high empathy. And so the first few iterations that we tried were intended to be optimizations on our current product without like restructuring the whole product. So we figured, okay, well, let's just reduce the amount of work that there is to do each day. Fairly straightforward. It turns out that when you reduce the amount of work, all that happens is those people that were doing a little bit less than you had originally set them to do, they end up doing even less. The people that were like benchmarking against your original goal, they end up benchmarking against the same goal. Everyone just basically changes their expectations downward and then still finds it frustrating that there's too much to do. So we thought, okay, well, that's not exactly the right change that we needed to do. So then we figured that the problem was one of flexibility. Some people want to do more, some people want to do less. Let's make a lot of the content optional. So we tucked away a bunch of the content into this like kind of expandable section and let people just do what they wanted to do. The problem was that like once you make something optional, people, weight loss isn't and behavior change isn't fun. People are generally going to orient towards the minimum that they have to do. And so suddenly everything that became optional became essentially not done anymore. And so everyone was orienting again towards the minimum, which resulted in real impacts to their weight loss and their progress. So then we decided that we really needed to take a step back. We had probably spent 4 months now running like 3 to 4 different experiments in this area. And they were all intended to be scrappy experiments that were built on our existing platform. So we actually decided we knew we needed to solve this problem. We didn't want to give up on this problem of pacing. So we actually went back and did a design sprint, which is this concept from Google where you take a week or so, have a tight collaboration where people just work on one particular problem with the goal of having a working prototype that you can use or test at the end. So we did a design sprint on what ended up being a completely new layout for our home screen because it required actually recognizing different classes of tasks based on time sensitivity. And that turned into what was eventually the biggest update that we've ever made to the Gnome product design since I've been here, which was changing the program delivery and changing the home screen to orient around the pacing of the program so that it stuck with you and didn't go on without you. And honestly, we should have done that from the beginning. Like this was a big enough change and a big enough problem that we knew we needed to tackle. This was a case where valley jumping was the right call, not micro optimization. We just couldn't optimize our way out of that problem space.
Yeah, great story. Quick note to the audience, we have about 6 minutes left, so feel free to drop in more questions into the stage chat. We have one that we haven't yet touched on from Manny, which talks about, and maybe the larger question here for me is like, how do you design your product strategy, and how much effort do you put in towards building things for coaches or internal use cases versus building new features for your users?
It varies a lot. And so I think like ultimately people talk about product strategy, and I think you can't really talk about product strategy without thinking about company strategy, and really understanding like from a company perspective, what's the most important bottleneck that you have as an organization in the coming however timeframe, like 1 year or so. So for us, 2 years ago or so, the biggest bottleneck was around unit economics. And so we really wanted to get to a point where we could balance out the unit economics and say that we were profitable on a per unit basis. And so that required, obviously bringing down our acquisition costs, which was an ongoing effort from the growth team. And then on the core product side, it was about bringing down our COGS. And the primary driver of our COGS was the coaching cost. And so that was an exercise in really trying to boost the efficiency of coaching. And so we set a goal around essentially increasing the scale of the coach without any drop in user quality and user engagement, that kind of thing. So that was a case where, based on that definition, we weren't really optimizing directly around the user value. We were just operating around coaching efficiency and coaching tooling. We eventually hit our goals on that front, and then the focus shifted instead to more of an LTV focus for the company. And so since then, we've essentially been almost 100% aligned, focused on user quality right now. So very little of our time currently is going to trying to improve coach efficiency or coach tooling, because we're fairly happy with how things are going on that front. And so all of our time is on the core user quality stuff, which obviously involves coaching, but through the lens of user quality. Now, I think that's honestly my answer is a little bit a function of being very resource constrained. I find that it's very dangerous to have like multiple hats when you have a small team. In general, I'm a fan of, as much as possible, each PM has one KPI that they're responsible for, not two. So when you have a team of 3 PMs, you can only have 3 KPIs, and even better if they're all in the same area so they can like learn from each other. As we grow, I'm sure we'll be able to start working on cases where both of these things are in progress at the same time.
Awesome. So we probably have time for just one last question. So I'm just going to pick. We've got lots of great questions here, but there's this question on your different PMs and the metrics that they each follow. So can you tell us a little bit more about like what are these different metrics? How do they tie into your product strategy? And how do these PMs work together?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's very important that each PM on a team has a metric that they're oriented towards. Like I'll talk about a couple of different metrics actually, but they don't necessarily have to be unique metrics. Right. I do think that the same the same metric can be applied to multiple PMs. They're just trying to affect it through different levers. And the way that, the way you attribute the movements in those metrics to individual PMs is through experimentation. That's the beauty of experiments, right? You're not tracking a macro level metric and just watching it go up. You know the changes that you're making and how much they're influencing that metric. And so you can actually attribute the work done by each of these different areas in terms of how much it's contributing to the macro level metric. That said, it is, of course, necessary to have multiple metrics. Generally, the guideline that we try to follow is have a mix of leading and lagging indicators. The lagging indicator is the one that's probably least under your control, but the one that you actually care about. And that would be something like engagement or retention. Like I can't wave a magic wand and make that happen. The leading indicators are things that are a little bit more under your control, like what percentage of users are introduced to this feature or how many meals are they logging. Even that's not completely under our control, but it's a little bit more of an approximate metric, with the advantage that if, as is the case 90% of the time, if I can't move the lagging indicator, then at least I can look to the leading indicator or indicators and see if they've moved in a positive way. So generally speaking, the way it works for my team is the lagging indicators are often shared between multiple PMs, but then the leading indicators, which are very tailored to a specific domain and the specific levers that a PM team is working with, those are the ones that are individual for a particular PM.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that question and all of your thoughts during this session, Raj. It's been super informative for us to learn from you. And thank you, everyone, for participating and asking these great questions.
Awesome.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Thanks,